What if one forgotten tomb in Egypt contained a measurement that historians have spent decades ignoring? Not a myth, not a legend, an actual number carved into stone. Deep beneath the sands of Saqqara stands a little-known tomb that rarely appears in guidebooks and almost never makes headlines. Yet inside that chamber is an inscription describing mysterious builders whose recorded height appears far beyond anything considered human. Were they merely symbolic figures, as mainstream explanations suggest? Or was the ancient scribe documenting something far stranger? As hidden chambers continue to be detected beneath Egypt's most famous monuments, and unanswered questions surround discoveries that remain sealed to this day, a forgotten inscription is forcing a difficult question. Did the ancient Egyptians preserve memories of builders from a time before recorded history? In the vast necropolis of Saqqara, thousands of tombs have been excavated, catalogued, and studied. Most belong to officials, nobles, priests, and members of Egypt's ruling elite. Yet among these structures sits a relatively obscure tomb identified as S2341, a site that has received remarkably little public attention, despite several unusual details recorded by early researchers. The tomb dates to approximately 2600 BCE, during Egypt's Third Dynasty, a period often associated with some of the earliest large-scale stone construction projects in human history. Unlike famous monuments that attract millions of visitors, this tomb remains largely unknown outside specialized archaeological circles. What makes the site remarkable is a carved panel located on its eastern wall. The panel depicts several large figures standing beside a much smaller human figure. According to conventional Egyptological interpretation, the difference in scale is symbolic. Ancient Egyptian artists frequently represented kings, gods, and important individuals larger than ordinary people to indicate status rather than actual size. At first glance, the explanation appears reasonable. However, researchers who examined records associated with the panel noticed something unusual. Near the figures appears what has been described as a measurement inscription. Rather than merely identifying the figures, the text seems to assign a specific numerical value connected to them. This detail drew attention decades ago when Egyptian archaeologist Selim Hassan documented aspects of the tomb during his extensive studies of Old Kingdom sites. In his notes, Hassan reportedly described the measurement as anomalous, a curious observation that received little further discussion in later publications. For most archaeological sites, unusual inscriptions eventually become the subject of debate, reanalysis, and academic papers. Yet according to researchers who have followed the story, this particular measurement has remained largely absent from mainstream discussion for decades. The question is simple. Why would a symbolic figure require a precise measurement at all? That question becomes even more intriguing when the inscription itself is examined more closely. The most controversial element of the Saqqara inscription is not the artwork itself. Ancient Egyptian monuments are filled with oversized figures, and historians have long explained these images as symbolic representations of power, rank, or divine status. What makes this case different is the claim that the figures were accompanied by a numerical measurement. According to researchers who have examined references to the inscription, the text describes a group of beings using the term Ntra. The phrase is commonly translated as Great God or Great Divine Being, but the second word, Ah, also carried a more practical meaning in the Egyptian language. It could simply mean large, great, or tall, depending on the context in which it appeared. In administrative records, similar terminology was often used to describe the dimensions of structures, canals, storage facilities, and other physical objects. Because of this, some alternative researchers argue that the phrase may have been intended as a description rather than a purely religious title. The debate becomes even more interesting when measurements enter the picture. The inscription reportedly lists a height of 7 royal cubits, along with an additional 2 spans. In ancient Egypt, the royal cubit served as one of the standard units of measurement and measured roughly 20.6 inches. A span represented the width of an outstretched hand, and measured approximately 9 inches. When modern researchers attempt to convert those values into modern units, the resulting figure becomes unusually large. Depending on how the calculation is interpreted, the height exceeds anything associated with ordinary human proportions. That is precisely why the inscription continues to attract attention among those who question whether the figures were meant to be viewed as purely symbolic. Skeptics immediately point out that ancient texts often blended history, religion, symbolism, and mythology into a single narrative. A recorded measurement does not automatically prove that giant beings once existed. Ancient cultures frequently exaggerated characteristics to emphasize importance, authority, or supernatural qualities. Yet supporters of the alternative interpretation raise a different question. If the purpose was merely symbolic, why record a specific numerical value at all? Why not simply portray the figures at a larger scale, as Egyptian artists had done countless times before? This question becomes even more intriguing when the figures themselves are examined. Rather than carrying royal insignia, ceremonial staffs, or objects typically associated with gods, the figures appear to be holding tools. Their posture suggests activity rather than worship. Their arms extend forward. Their bodies lean toward a block of stone beneath them. Instead of looking like rulers overseeing construction, they appear to resemble workers engaged in the process itself. Whether that interpretation is correct remains a matter of debate. However, it introduces a possibility that would shape everything that follows. Perhaps the inscription was not attempting to describe rulers, priests, or deities. Perhaps it was describing builders. If the measurement alone were the only unusual feature of the Saqqara panel, most historians would likely dismiss it as another example of symbolic language from the ancient world. However, the figures themselves present a second mystery, one that has fueled decades of speculation among researchers who believe the inscription may be describing something more than mythology. The panel reportedly depicts 4 large figures standing in a line. At first glance, the scene appears simple, yet the objects held in their hands have become a major point of debate. Rather than carrying symbols normally associated with Egyptian gods or kings, the figures appear to hold tools that resemble large stoneworking adzes. An adze was one of the most important tools in the ancient builder's toolkit. Similar in purpose to an axe or chisel, it was used to shape, smooth, and refine surfaces made from wood or stone. Variations of the tool have been found throughout Egyptian history, appearing in workshops, construction sites, and depictions of craftsmen at work. The significance of this detail cannot be ignored. Throughout Egyptian religious art, gods were usually shown carrying objects linked to their specific roles and identities. Ra was associated with the solar disk. Osiris commonly appeared with the crook and flail. Thoth was linked to writing and knowledge. Their symbols served as visual markers, allowing viewers to identify them immediately. The figures on the Saqqara panel appear different. According to descriptions of the carving, the tools are directed downward toward a stone block rather than being raised in a ceremonial position. Their bodies lean slightly forward, and their arms extend toward the surface below them. To some observers, the scene resembles labor rather than ritual. This distinction is important because posture often carried meaning in Egyptian art. When priests performed sacred ceremonies involving tools, those actions were usually represented in a highly formalized manner. The positions were deliberate, symbolic, and carefully arranged. In contrast, scenes depicting workers often emphasized movement, effort, and interaction with physical materials. Supporters of the alternative interpretation argue that the figures on the panel appear closer to the second category. They see not a religious ceremony, but a construction scene frozen in stone. Of course, critics remain unconvinced. Many Egyptologists caution that artistic scenes cannot always be interpreted literally. Ancient Egyptian artists followed conventions that are often unfamiliar to modern viewers, and a posture that appears practical to a modern observer may have carried an entirely different symbolic meaning thousands of years ago. Even so, the imagery continues to raise questions. Why depict these beings with tools instead of traditional divine symbols? Why place them in apparent contact with a block of stone? And perhaps most importantly, why combine that imagery with a numerical measurement that appears to describe their physical size? The mystery becomes even deeper when similar descriptions begin appearing elsewhere. Far from Saqqara, at another ancient site connected to some of Egypt's most enigmatic structures, researchers have pointed to inscriptions that appear to reference comparable beings associated with monumental construction. Whether those connections are genuine or merely coincidental remains a subject of fierce debate, yet the similarities have encouraged some investigators to look beyond a single tomb and ask a much larger question. What if the story carved into the wall of S2341 was never meant to stand alone? What if it was only one surviving fragment of a much older tradition? A tradition claiming that extraordinary builders existed long before the rise of the pharaohs themselves? More than 300 miles south of Saqqara lies one of the most mysterious structures in all of Egypt. Hidden near the sacred city of Abydos, the Osirion has puzzled archaeologists ever since its discovery, not because of elaborate decorations or royal treasures, but because of the extraordinary scale of its construction. When British archaeologist Flinders Petrie investigated the site in the early 20th century, he found a monument unlike most known Egyptian structures. Massive granite blocks formed its walls and passageways, creating an underground complex that appeared far older than many of the buildings surrounding it. Some of the stones used in the Osirion weigh between 50 and 100 tons. Even today, moving blocks of that size would require careful planning and specialized equipment. Ancient Egyptian builders were undoubtedly capable of remarkable engineering achievements, yet the methods used to quarry, transport, position, and align such enormous stones continue to generate debate among researchers. The structure's dimensions add another layer to the mystery. Several passageways and entrances are significantly larger than what would be necessary for ordinary human movement. Certain openings rise to heights of roughly 4.5 meters, creating an impression of scale that many visitors describe as overwhelming. Mainstream archaeology explains these proportions as architectural choices designed to inspire awe and emphasize sacred importance. Alternative researchers see something different. They argue that the unusual dimensions, combined with the immense stone blocks, may preserve memories of builders who were remembered as larger than ordinary humans. While this interpretation remains highly controversial, it has become a recurring theme in discussions surrounding ancient Egyptian construction. The connection to the Saqqara inscription emerges through claims that similar terminology appears at both locations. According to some researchers, references associated with the Osirion include descriptions of powerful beings connected to construction activities and sacred enclosures. Although mainstream translations generally interpret such references within a religious framework, alternative readings suggest that the texts may preserve traditions about ancient builders who existed before Egypt's dynastic period. Whether those interpretations are accurate remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Osirion occupies a unique place in Egyptian archaeology. Even experts who reject theories involving lost civilizations or giant builders often acknowledge that the monument raises difficult questions. Its design differs from many surrounding structures, and aspects of its construction continue to be studied today. This uncertainty has created fertile ground for speculation. Whenever historians encounter a monument whose methods of construction are not fully understood, alternative explanations inevitably emerge. Some theories propose forgotten technologies. Others suggest knowledge inherited from an earlier culture. A few go even further, proposing that ancient traditions may have preserved distorted memories of beings whose abilities exceeded those of ordinary people. Most scholars remain skeptical of such conclusions, emphasizing that gaps in knowledge do not automatically prove extraordinary claims. Nevertheless, the Osirion continues to attract attention because it represents one of those rare places where accepted answers remain incomplete. For researchers interested in the inscription from tomb S2341, the significance of Abydos lies not in proving the existence of giants, but in revealing a recurring pattern. At both sites, stories appear to connect monumental construction, with figures described as exceptional, powerful, and linked to an age that supposedly existed before the rise of the pharaohs. And according to the inscription at Saqqara, those builders were not merely constructing monuments. They were continuing work that had already begun in an even earlier era, a time that the text seems to describe as belonging to another age entirely. While the measurements and construction imagery attract most of the attention, some researchers believe the most important part of the inscription appears in a section that receives far less discussion. Hidden among the lines of text is a phrase that, if interpreted literally, seems to place the builders in a time long before the historical age of the pharaohs. According to reports associated with the inscription, the text contains wording that can be translated as the second time or the earlier occasion. At first glance, the phrase appears insignificant. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions often referred to past events, religious traditions, or legendary periods. Yet in this case, the wording appears directly alongside references to construction activity. That connection has become the focus of intense speculation. Some researchers argue that the inscription is not describing a single building project taking place during the Third Dynasty. Instead, they believe the text is referring to an earlier phase of construction that supposedly occurred in a distant age remembered by later Egyptians. If that interpretation is correct, the builders depicted on the wall were not being presented as the first creators of sacred structures. They were being linked to an older tradition, one that already existed before the events being recorded. The implications are significant. Ancient Egypt preserved numerous accounts describing earlier eras that existed before the official dynastic timeline. Egyptian texts frequently spoke of legendary ages when divine beings, semi-divine rulers, or sacred ancestors governed the land before human kings inherited authority. Modern historians generally view these accounts as mythology rather than historical records. To them, such stories served religious and symbolic purposes, helping explain the origins of society, kingship, and cosmic order. Alternative researchers approach the text differently. They argue that myths sometimes preserve fragments of genuine memories, distorted over centuries but rooted in real events. Under this view, stories about earlier ages may contain echoes of forgotten cultures, lost populations, or historical developments that predate conventional chronologies. The inscription's reference to temple construction has become central to that argument. The text reportedly associates the mysterious builders with the creations of sacred enclosures or temple complexes. These structures were among the most important institutions in Egyptian civilization. Temples served not only as religious centers but also as economic hubs, administrative headquarters, and symbols of royal authority. To claim that such places originated in a time before the pharaohs would represent a dramatic departure from the conventional historical narrative. That possibility explains why the inscription continues to generate fascination among alternative historians. If the wording is being interpreted correctly, then the text appears to preserve a memory of construction activity, taking place before the beginning of recorded Egyptian history. Of course, there is another explanation. Ancient Egyptian priests often projected religious concepts into a mythical past. By attributing temples, rituals, and sacred knowledge to an earlier divine age, they strengthened the authority of institutions that existed in their own time. In this interpretation, the builders were never intended to be historical figures at all. They were symbolic ancestors placed in a legendary era to emphasize the sacred origins of Egyptian civilization. Both interpretations remain possible. Yet the mystery deepens because the inscription does not simply describe builders from an earlier age. According to reports, it also claims that those beings eventually disappeared. They did not die in battle. They were not destroyed by catastrophe. Instead, the text suggests that they withdrew from the world that later Egyptians inherited. And it is this final detail that pushes the story from an archaeological curiosity into something far more mysterious. Because if the inscription is to be believed, the builders left behind more than monuments. They left behind an entire legacy that future generations struggled to understand. If the earlier sections of the inscription are controversial, the final reported passage is even more difficult to explain. According to researchers who have examined references to the text, the concluding lines describe what happened after the mysterious builders completed their work. Rather than remaining among ordinary people, or continuing to shape the civilization that followed, the beings are said to have departed. The wording itself has become the subject of considerable debate. One reported translation states that the builders withdrew into the sacred land. The phrase sounds simple, yet its meaning may be far more complex than it first appears. In ancient Egyptian tradition, the concept of a sacred land was often connected to regions associated with death, transformation, and the journey beyond the visible world. To modern readers, such language immediately evokes images of an afterlife. However, ancient Egyptian religious texts frequently used symbolic geography. Certain locations existed both as physical places and as spiritual destinations. Because of this dual meaning, it is often difficult to determine whether a text is describing an actual journey, a religious transition, or something that exists somewhere between the two. This uncertainty has allowed multiple interpretations to emerge. Traditional scholars generally view the phrase as religious language. Under this interpretation, the builders belong to a mythological framework, and their withdrawal into the sacred land represents a symbolic return to the divine realm. In other words, the text would be describing spiritual beings completing their role before departing from the world of humanity. Alternative researchers suggest a different possibility. They argue that the phrase may preserve a memory of a real group whose disappearance was later interpreted through a religious lens. Over centuries, stories about influential ancestors, rulers, or builders could have become intertwined with mythology until the distinction between history and legend was almost impossible to separate. This process is not unique to Egypt. Many ancient cultures told stories about powerful figures who arrived, established knowledge, built monuments, and then vanished. In some traditions, they sailed away across distant seas. In others, they ascended into the heavens or disappeared into hidden realms beneath the earth. Although the details differ, the pattern appears again and again throughout human history. The Egyptian version of the story follows a remarkably similar structure. First, extraordinary builders are associated with the creation of sacred structures. Then those builders are linked to an age preceding recorded history. Finally, they disappear into a mysterious destination that later generations regard as sacred. Whether these elements represent mythology, collective memory, or some combination of the two remains unknown. What makes the story particularly intriguing is that it does not end with the disappearance itself. Instead, it leaves behind a lingering question. If later Egyptians remembered these builders, where did that memory come from? Why preserve their story at all if they were merely symbolic figures created for religious purposes? Some researchers believe the answer may lie in Egypt's monuments themselves. For thousands of years, Egyptians lived among structures that already seemed ancient. Massive stone complexes, colossal foundations, and engineering achievements from earlier eras surrounded them. It is entirely possible that later generations inherited monuments whose origins had already become obscure, prompting stories about powerful builders from a forgotten age. In that sense, the inscription may reveal less about giants or lost civilizations, and more about how ancient people explained mysteries that existed even in their own time. Yet as fascinating as these ideas may be, the story becomes even stranger when modern technology enters the picture. Because in the 21st century, researchers using advanced scanning equipment discovered something hidden inside Egypt's most famous monument. The find made headlines around the world, generated enormous excitement, and then appeared to stall without a clear explanation. For those who follow mysteries surrounding ancient Egypt, the timing seemed impossible to ignore. Just as questions about forgotten builders were resurfacing, a vast hidden space was detected inside the Great Pyramid itself. For centuries, the Great Pyramid of Giza has stood as one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. Despite countless studies, surveys, and excavations, researchers continue to discover features that challenge assumptions about what is known and what remains hidden within its enormous mass of stone. One of the most surprising discoveries occurred in the 21st century when an international team of scientists launched a project known as scan pyramids. Unlike traditional archaeological expeditions, this effort relied on advanced technology capable of looking inside structures without damaging them. Among the methods employed was muon tomography, a technique often compared to an X-ray for massive stone monuments. The process uses naturally occurring subatomic particles called muons, which constantly pass through the Earth's atmosphere and penetrate solid materials. By measuring how many of these particles travel through different areas, scientists can identify hidden spaces concealed within dense structures. The technology offered something archaeologists had dreamed about for generations. For the first time, researchers could effectively peer inside parts of the Great Pyramid that had remained inaccessible for thousands of years. Then came the discovery that captured international attention. The scans revealed a previously unknown void located above the Grand Gallery, one of the pyramid's most famous internal passages. The hidden space appeared substantial in size, measuring approximately 30 meters in length and at least 2 meters in height. It was not a small crack, a minor cavity, or an isolated gap between stones. It was a significant feature hidden deep within one of the world's most studied monuments. The announcement quickly spread across global news outlets. Scientists described the discovery as one of the most important pyramid findings in decades. Archaeologists, engineers, and historians debated its possible purpose. Some suggested it might have played a role in relieving structural pressure. Others proposed that it could be connected to construction techniques used during the pyramid's creation. Yet, despite the excitement, a fundamental question remained unanswered. What exactly is inside the void? Years after its discovery, no direct exploration had taken place. No camera had entered the chamber. No physical examination had confirmed its contents. The space remained hidden, known only through indirect measurements collected by scanning equipment. For mainstream researchers, this situation is not unusual. Investigating hidden areas inside ancient monuments requires extensive planning, strict conservation procedures, and approval from multiple authorities. The absence of immediate exploration does not necessarily imply secrecy. It often reflects the difficulty of balancing scientific curiosity with the responsibility of preserving irreplaceable cultural heritage. Nevertheless, the lack of direct access fueled speculation. Alternative researchers viewed the discovery through a different lens. To them, the existence of a large unexplored chamber inside the Great Pyramid represented another example of unanswered questions accumulating around ancient Egypt. Combined with unusual inscriptions, disputed archaeological findings, and stories about forgotten builders, the hidden void became part of a larger narrative, suggesting that important pieces of history might still be waiting beneath the surface. Whether such conclusions are justified remains uncertain. What cannot be denied is that the void exists. Advanced scans detected it. Independent analyses confirmed its presence. And despite years of discussion, its exact purpose remains unknown. For many observers, that mystery alone is enough to spark curiosity. But the story does not stop inside the Great Pyramid. Around the same period that researchers were debating the significance of the hidden chamber, another investigation was taking place elsewhere in Egypt. This time, the focus was not on a pyramid, but on the ground beneath Saqqara itself. And according to reports from that survey, something unusual may have been detected beneath the very region where the mysterious tomb inscription was found. While the discovery of the Great Pyramid's hidden void attracted worldwide attention, a separate investigation was quietly unfolding at Saqqara. Unlike Giza, where towering monuments dominate the landscape, much of Saqqara's history remains buried beneath layers of sand and rock, waiting for future generations to uncover. For archaeologists, this creates both an opportunity and a challenge. Excavating every square meter of such an enormous site would take decades, if not centuries. As a result, researchers increasingly rely on non-invasive technologies that allow them to examine what lies underground before any excavation begins. One of the most effective tools for this purpose is ground-penetrating radar. The technology works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the soil and measuring the signals that bounce back. Differences in density, composition, and structure create distinctive patterns that can reveal buried walls, chambers, passageways, and other features hidden below the surface. In 2020, reports emerged describing a radar survey conducted in portions of the Saqqara Plateau. According to those accounts, researchers identified several underground anomalies that appeared inconsistent with the surrounding natural geology. Among the most discussed features were a series of subsurface chambers located at depths ranging between approximately 4 and 7 meters below ground level. The radar signatures suggested large enclosed spaces rather than isolated pockets or random geological formations. One of the reported structures attracted particular attention. Based on interpretations of the survey data, the chamber appeared to cover an area measuring roughly 22 meters by 14 meters. To visualize that scale, imagine a space comparable in size to a modern sports court hidden beneath the desert floor. At this stage, however, an important distinction must be made. Ground-penetrating radar does not produce photographs. It does not reveal the exact contents of a buried structure. Instead, it identifies anomalies that may indicate the presence of something artificial or unusual beneath the surface. Until excavation occurs, researchers can only estimate what those signals represent. This uncertainty has done little to discourage speculation. For alternative researchers, the location of the anomalies immediately stood out. The reported chambers appeared within the broader region, associated with the mysterious tomb inscription, and other archaeological features that have fueled debate about Egypt's earliest history. To them, the possibility seemed tantalizing. If large underground spaces truly exist beneath this part of Saqqara, what might they contain? Additional tombs, storage chambers, ritual complexes, evidence of construction phases predating known dynasties, or something entirely unexpected? Mainstream archaeology approaches such questions more cautiously. History has repeatedly shown that radar anomalies often turn out to be less dramatic than initial interpretations suggest. What appears to be a chamber can sometimes prove to be a natural cavity, a collapsed feature, or a geological formation that simply resembles human construction on radar images, yet uncertainty cuts both ways. Until the sites are fully investigated, no one can say with certainty what lies below. The anomalies remain possibilities rather than conclusions, and that ambiguity continues to fuel curiosity. Another factor has intensified public interest. According to various reports, proposals to conduct further excavation in the area face delays and administrative hurdles. While such delays are common in archaeology and often result from funding, conservation concerns, or permit procedures, they have nevertheless become a focal point for researchers who believe important discoveries may still be waiting underground. To skeptics, these delays are ordinary bureaucracy. To others, they appear as yet another chapter in a long history of unanswered questions surrounding Egypt's ancient past. Regardless of which interpretation one accepts, one fact remains clear. Beneath the sands of Saqqara, there are still areas that have not been fully explored. Hidden structures may exist there, and until they are investigated directly, speculation will continue to fill the gaps left by incomplete information. And for some researchers, those gaps are not accidental. They believe the pattern extends far beyond modern excavation permits and reaches deep into history itself, involving centuries of lost records, destroyed texts, and forgotten accounts that may have once told a very different story about Egypt's earliest builders. One of the most powerful ideas in any historical mystery is the possibility that crucial evidence once existed, but was later lost, destroyed, or forgotten. Throughout history, entire libraries have vanished, cities have been abandoned, and countless documents have disappeared through war, natural disasters, political upheaval, and the simple passage of time. Ancient Egypt was no exception. Across more than 3,000 years of recorded history, dynasties rose and fell. Religions transformed, capitals shifted, and rulers attempted to reshape how future generations would remember the past. In many cases, these efforts were successful. Names were erased from monuments, statues were destroyed, records disappeared. Entire chapters of history were rewritten. One of the most frequently cited examples involves the pharaoh Akhenaten. During the 14th century BCE, Akhenaten introduced dramatic religious reforms that challenged powerful traditions deeply rooted in Egyptian society. After his death, many of those reforms were reversed. His monuments were dismantled, references to his reign were removed, and later rulers attempted to restore the older religious order. For historians, this episode demonstrates how effectively ancient governments could reshape historical memory. If the name of a pharaoh could be removed from temples across Egypt, what other information might have vanished over the centuries? Alternative researchers often point to this question when discussing unusual inscriptions and disputed archaeological claims. They argue that evidence challenging accepted historical narratives may have been lost long ago, leaving only scattered fragments behind. Another event frequently mentioned in these discussions is the destruction of the Serapeum at Alexandria during the late Roman period. Ancient Alexandria was one of the intellectual centers of the ancient world. Its scholars collected texts from across the Mediterranean, preserving knowledge from countless civilizations. Although the exact contents of many lost collections remain unknown, the destruction of libraries and archives associated with Alexandria has become a symbol of humanity's lost knowledge. The problem, however, is that lost records create a unique challenge. Because the documents no longer exist, they can support almost any theory. Historians must therefore distinguish between what can be demonstrated through surviving evidence and what remains speculative. The absence of a text cannot be used as proof of what the text contained. Nevertheless, stories of missing records continue to capture public imagination. They become even more intriguing when connected to early European explorations of Egypt. During Napoleon's expedition at the end of the 18th century, scholars documented countless monuments, inscriptions, and archaeological sites. Their work eventually contributed to the monumental publication known as Description de l'Egypte, one of the most ambitious surveys of ancient Egypt ever produced. Because the project involved such a vast amount of material, questions occasionally arise regarding missing illustrations, incomplete records, and documents that were never widely distributed. Most historians attribute these issues to the practical realities of 19th century publishing and archiving. Alternative researchers often interpret them differently. To them, gaps in historical records may indicate that certain discoveries were overlooked, ignored, or quietly set aside because they conflicted with prevailing views of history. While direct evidence for deliberate suppression is often difficult to establish, the possibility itself remains a recurring theme in discussions about ancient mysteries. The same pattern appears in debates surrounding museum collections. Major institutions around the world hold thousands of artifacts that have never been fully studied or published. Limited funding, staffing constraints, conservation priorities, and the sheer volume of material mean that countless objects remain in storage for years or even decades. For mainstream scholars, this situation reflects logistical reality. For alternative researchers, it raises another provocative question. How many overlooked artifacts might contain information capable of reshaping our understanding of the ancient world? Whether one views these concerns as justified skepticism or speculative storytelling, they contribute to a larger narrative. A narrative suggesting that pieces of the puzzle may exist, scattered across archives, storage rooms, excavation reports, and forgotten collections, waiting for someone to connect them. And according to supporters of the mysterious builder theory, one modern figure became closely associated with the debate over who gets permission to search for those missing pieces. That debate would eventually center on a man who became one of the most influential and controversial figures in modern Egyptian archaeology. As the mystery surrounding ancient builders continued to attract attention, the discussion gradually shifted away from inscriptions and monuments, and toward a different question entirely. Who decides which theories are investigated and which remain on the fringes? In Egypt, archaeological research is not simply a matter of arriving at a site and beginning an excavation. Every survey, excavation, scan, and research project requires approval from the authorities responsible for protecting the country's cultural heritage. These regulations exist for an important reason. Egypt's archaeological sites are among the most valuable historical resources on Earth, and careless exploration can cause irreversible damage. Yet this necessary system has also become a source of controversy. Researchers whose proposals are rejected often argue that potentially important discoveries remain unexplored, while authorities maintain that limited resources require careful prioritization. The tension between preservation and investigation has existed for decades and continues today. No figure became more closely associated with that debate than Zahi Hawass. For years, Hawass served as one of the most influential voices in Egyptian archaeology. He appeared in documentaries, oversaw major projects, managed excavation approvals, and became internationally recognized as a defender of Egypt's historical heritage. To supporters, he played a crucial role in protecting archaeological sites from sensationalism, pseudoscience, and poorly supported claims. Critics viewed his role differently. Some alternative researchers argued that unconventional theories received little consideration under the existing system. They claimed that investigations involving pre-dynastic civilizations, lost cultures, or radically different interpretations of Egyptian history often struggled to gain traction. One of the names frequently mentioned in this context is Robert Schoch. Schoch became well known for proposing that weathering patterns on the Great Sphinx might indicate an age significantly older than the conventional chronology accepted by most Egyptologists. His conclusions generated widespread debate and strong criticism from many scholars. Yet they also attracted a substantial audience interested in alternative views of ancient history. According to various reports, Schoch later expressed interest in conducting additional investigations in parts of the Saqqara region, including areas connected to theories about pre-dynastic activity. Supporters of his work have argued that certain proposals faced repeated obstacles or failed to move forward. Mainstream archaeologists offer a different perspective. They point out that permit denials occur for many reasons unrelated to suppression. Research projects compete for limited funding, personnel, equipment, and access to sensitive sites. In addition, extraordinary claims generally require exceptionally strong evidence before authorities are willing to allocate significant resources toward testing them. This disagreement highlights a larger issue. The debate is no longer solely about inscriptions, giant builders, hidden chambers, or lost civilizations. It is also about how knowledge is produced, how evidence is evaluated, and how scientific institutions balance openness to new ideas with the responsibility to maintain rigorous standards. Both sides claim to be protecting the truth. Alternative researchers argue that important possibilities are being dismissed before they can be properly investigated. Traditional scholars argue that speculation should not be treated as evidence, and that extraordinary conclusions must be supported by verifiable data. Between these positions lies a vast area of uncertainty. The reality is that archaeology rarely delivers simple answers. Every discovery raises new questions. Every excavation reveals additional layers of complexity. And every generation reinterprets the evidence through the lens of new technologies and new perspectives. That is precisely why mysteries like the inscription in Tomb S2341 continue to survive. The inscription exists. The questions surrounding it exist. The disagreements over its meaning exist. Yet, despite decades of discussion, no consensus has emerged that satisfies everyone involved. And perhaps that is what makes the story so compelling. Not because it proves the existence of giant builders, not because it confirms a lost civilization, but because it sits at the intersection of evidence, interpretation, and possibility, where history becomes less about certainty and more about the search for answers. So what are we left with? A little-known tomb at Saqqara, a controversial measurement carved into stone, figures that appear to be carrying construction tools, references to builders connected to an earlier age, stories describing a mysterious departure into a sacred land, hidden spaces detected by modern scanning technologies, underground anomalies that remain largely unexplored, and a continuing debate over how much of Egypt's earliest history is truly understood. None of these elements, on their own, prove the existence of giant beings, or a forgotten civilization that predates the pharaohs. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and many of the theories discussed in this story remain highly controversial. Yet the unanswered questions are real. Ancient Egypt still contains mysteries that challenge researchers, inspire debate, and capture the imagination of millions around the world. Every new discovery reminds us that history is not a finished book. It is an ongoing investigation, constantly revised as new evidence comes to light. Perhaps future excavations will reveal perfectly ordinary explanations for the anomalies discussed in this video. Or perhaps they will uncover something nobody expected. Until that day arrives, the inscription in Tomb S2341 remains part of one of Egypt's most intriguing mysteries, inviting each generation to decide for itself where the line between history, memory, and legend truly lies. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed exploring this mystery and would like to join us for more investigations into the world's most fascinating ancient secrets, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upcoming episode. And remember, sometimes the greatest discoveries are not the answers we find, but the questions that refuse to disappear.